All right. The other thing that I love about this experience with the CIH is I got to make an additional new friend in Dr. Allison Graham at Fort Calgary. So Allison is going to be the moderator, and she's also going to be the person that I get to look at to make sure that my mic is on and that the screen is actually doing what it's supposed to be. So can you see my slides, Allison?
Yeah, you look great. The slides look great.
I look great. The slides are great. Let's do this. This is going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so here's how this is going to proceed. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I was doing with the CIH. This talk changed a little bit over the course of the 8 or so months since I was supposed to give it. And one of the great things that happened was Jim reached out to me, I don't know, in February or maybe January, and said, Fort Calgary is looking for a joint event. He's like, what do you think about you doing your talk at Fort Calgary? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. I think that's such a great idea. I will open it up to a couple more people. I think it's gonna be fantastic. And so originally this was going to be kind of mostly just focused on the work that I was doing in the CIH and kind of tying in a little Fort Calgary element of it. But it's changed a little bit, and I've kind of modified it to make it a little bit more, kind of more of a community talk. So what that means is, I'll tell you what that means is. Go. So here are my goals. So I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes. And then Allison and I are going to have kind of a moderated back and forth. And then we're going to open up a conversation to anyone who's got questions in the chat. And Allison will kind of feed them to me and I'll kind of work through them. If for whatever reason we don't get to your question or you think of it later, email me. I'm very happy to keep this conversation going offline. And just send me an email. You can find me really easily. Just Google Daniel, both Calgary, Métis, or something, and I should pop right up. If you just kind of put those search terms into Google, you should be able to find me. So great. So what I mean by kind of the goals I'm having is, this is a talk that I've kind of designed for a community audience. So the academics in the audience are going to notice that there's not a lot of methods here. I've stripped out the methods, and in part because what I'm going to do is combine 3 different research projects that normally I wouldn't talk about them at the same time because they have different methods. But for community purposes, I think there's really helpful things to kind of focus on across all 3, and then put all 3 of the kind of the stories that I tell into conversation. And that tends to, from the working with my own community over the last number of years, I find that people are not super interested in the nitty gritty of my methods and that sort of thing. They want to hear about their peoplehood and their self-determination and their trajectory for the future. And so that's kind of what this talk is more oriented towards. The core thing that I'm interested in talking a little bit about with you today is, what do assertions of Indigenous political authority tell us about Indigenous territory and belonging? And what I mean by Indigenous political authority is Indigenous peoples have a set of laws and customs and lawmaking and politics that allows them to say things and govern their own territories in a way that their own people acknowledge. And you don't have to use police or an army or something to make your other people do something. People agree that these are the Métis laws. So that's more about like consent and legitimacy to govern, right? That's kind of what I mean by Indigenous political authority. We see that other people, our own Indigenous communities, but also other Indigenous communities, have laws that allow them to govern their territories in a particular way. So that's kind of what I'm kind of orienting this towards. And what I mean by Indigenous territory and belonging is, we have these relationships that connect us to the land in really robust and important ways. And that creates senses of community and belonging for us, right, in Indigenous communities. And that includes our non-human animals and kin, land, water, mountains, like that sort of stuff. And so that's kind of the thing that I'm interested in kind of getting towards. And I'm going to do that by painting you what I'm calling 3 vignettes, or 3 vignettes or 3 scenes. You can kind of think of it either way. So these are going to be stories that I'm going to tell, and we're going to do a little bit of reading together, and I'll walk us through that. And I'm going to paint some pictures. And the first picture I'm going to paint, vignette number 1, this picture is about Métis looking inward. It's a story about us looking at each other in a time of significant change. And I want to kind of pull out what was happening there. It was also the core thing that I was doing in my fellowship at the CIH, so I'll talk mostly about that. But then I also have two other little vignettes that I'm going to paint for you too. And the second one is about Métis people looking outwards, about Métis people looking out at the kind of the great vast space of the Northwest Plains and being like, who's out there? And what does that mean for us as Métis people? And then the final one I'm going to talk about is about Blackfoot looking at the Métis. And I'm going to paint a final kind of picture about that. And then we'll talk about why those things matter and why they're interesting. Okay, so let's get going. Here we go. Vignette number one, which the theme I'm kind of calling it is political authority in the love and animosity among kin. And you need some, just for the folks who might not be totally up on the history of Métis politics and Métis political thought, I'll just give you some background on what you need to know about to kind of grapple with this vignette. In 1869-70, there was a major change. Canada looked to the Northwest Territories, or the Northwest, kind of the Northwest Plains, and said, we would like for that to be part of Canada. And the Métis people there said, maybe. You can't just come here and take it. We, an Indigenous people of this space, must provide consent. And that kicked off a large number of meetings and conventions and all kinds of things in which Métis people tried to express themselves on what it is that they thought the deal should be with Canada. And that played out in a really interesting way in a newspaper called The New Nation, which was kind of forged out of this first Riel resistance, 1869-70. That's often called the first Riel resistance, in part because Louis Riel is kind of the leader of it. So I've given you two things here. The first across the top is the New Nation banner that gives you a sense of what the paper looked like. These were papers written on as broadsheets, big papers like that, long, like 6-7 columns all across this thing, tiny little print. You could get a lot on there. All text, very few no pictures. I don't actually remember seeing any pictures in there, all text. And in it, the editors said, this is such an important thing that's happening where we're debating how we want to, if and how we want to enter Canada, that we better put the proceedings of these meetings into the paper because the public is going to want to know. The public's going to want to know. And so you can kind of see there, it's dated Winnipeg on Friday, February 4th, 1870. And that is a shot from the original. So that's the paper where these debates are happening about what do we want our relationship to Canada to look like. And then the thing on the right-hand side of your screen is an actual shot from the convention debates in the paper itself. So that's just a little snippet from one of the columns. And it kind of sets the stage in a way that I have a hard time doing on my own. So I thought most of my research, I'm very connected to the texts. I'm very interested in what Métis people were thinking and writing about and the way that they were saying things. So I'm gonna walk us through, I'll walk you through together some of the key texts, and we'll talk about them as we go. So let's just kind of move this. So this is the English and French delegates in council, and I'll talk about that in a second. English and French representatives in session. The minutes having been read and confirmed and the roll call, Dr. Bird and secretary of the committee appointed to draw up the Bill of Rights presented the list prepared by the committee, which was handed to the secretaries. The document was one containing a list of demands in the event the country entering the Dominion as a territory. So that kind of sets the stage for what's happening. What they're referring to with English and French delegates was the core thing I was interested in and researching during my CIH fellowship. There's been a lot of debate about, was the Red River kind of community really divided? Was it really two separate communities? And one of them were French first language Catholics. They would call themselves Métis or Michif. And was the other community these English first language Protestant, what at the time were called half-breeds. And that term was used at that time very honestly. It didn't have a lot of the pejorative terms that we attach to it today, which is why we don't use it anymore. But at the time, that was a very common term that you would use, and it was not controversial. Were those two completely separate communities? Or was that a community that was a single community, but just had differences within it? And I was trying to tease that out and answer that question. I won't talk too much about that, in part because I have a subsequent publication that's all about methods, about how I'm trying to tease out the weight of those sorts of things. But that's essentially what's the reference to English and French delegates is. Those are different parts of the Métis community that have come together to make decisions about what they want their relationship to Canada to look like. Yeah, so that's what you need to know in order to kind of know what comes next. So here we go. There he is, handsome devil, Louis Riel. So Louis Riel is engaged in this first resistance, and he convenes a convention of 40. That's what this legislative kind of body is described as, is the Convention of 40. It means that there's 20 delegates from French parishes and 20 delegates from English parishes. They all come together and they're trying to figure out, what do we want our relationship to Canada look like? And the first kind of sub-theme of this vignette is about division. So Riel is absolutely one of the key people who kind of really talks about the division between French and English communities in Red River and in the Métis Nation. And so this is one of the things he says at the outset of these meetings. He says, "I came here with fear. We are not yet enemies," which everyone goes, yay. He said, "but we came very near being so. But we came very near being so." He and a couple of other people that are attached to the French parishes do talk a lot in those meetings about, what does the English community want? Well, that's different from what the French community wants, and we should have maybe separate processes for dealing with that. And so there absolutely is strong evidence for some fairly significant divisions between French and English, the French and English communities in Red River at the time. Also Riel is providing a general emphasis on what the French section wants over what the English section. So as they're going through all their demands, he is really putting an emphasis on this. But the next vignette I want to talk a little bit about is the one that it's kind of this next sub-theme is kinship. How are people related to each other? And I want to move you through a little bit of text here. So one of the things that the Convention of 40 talked about is, should we create essentially a Métis army as part of this process of entering Canada? We're a bit nervous about it. Maybe it would be a good idea for us to have our own force drawn from the Métis population. And on that, there's a really interesting debate that happens. And let's move through, I want to move through it together here. So don't be overwhelmed by the text. I'm going to move through it with you. A guy named Mr. Fraser, who's one of the English delegates, he is born in the community. He's not himself native, but he sees himself as part of the native fabric of the territory. Like, he sees himself in that particular way. And this is what he says: "I have several objections to this article. Go through the length and breadth of the settlement, and you will find the people forming a long link of family connection. In this state of affairs, should any disturbance arise in any part of the settlement, how could I feel disposed, if I were in the army, to fight cousins or other relatives to the right or left of me? How could I answer a call which might compel me to fight my own father, brother, or son? I could not do it," he says. So one of the things I think that's important here is he's identifying something that comes up many, many times in this gathering, in this political gathering, in which people are like, we're kind of related to each other. You know, the French folks have English relatives, the English folks have French relatives. Many of them speak each other's languages. You know, French and English, it's a very multilingual space, the Northwest. Many of them speak Cree or Soto or Anishinaabe-Moin. It's a very multilingual space. Many of them speak both French and English. In response to this, Riel gets back up on his feet, and this is what he says. "Mr. Fraser tells us that the settlement is related from end to end. That very fact, I say, strengthens our present position. Had it not been for the relationship existing between the people of this settlement, there would be, in all probability, have been very serious trouble within the last few months. The very relationship of which Mr. Fraser speaks was then our safeguard, and it will be our safeguard in the future." I love this in part because we get to read Indigenous people making speeches to each other, right? I just think it's so exciting to kind of see us playing out our politics in this really visceral way. And one of the things that I think Riel is having to respond to here is he's kind of confronting the reality that while he thinks of himself as being very divided from English Protestants, The rest of the community doesn't really seem to share that view, in part because this keeps coming up. It keeps coming up saying, well, we don't really want different things, right? We have disagreements, but we're not really divided in that kind of very kind of conventional sense. There's not a chasm between us. We're related to each other. And so he's kind of having to acknowledge that in order to advance his own agenda, is being like, okay, so maybe we're not so divided. And then the next thing I've got two more little pieces I want to talk to you about. The first one is the hay privilege. This is a long ongoing dispute that ends up showing up in court cases in the last couple of years. But the hay privilege is essentially this. Behind the river lots that people live on, they got their house and they're right on the river, there's usually this 2-mile stretch of land that people can go and cut hay, cut the grass, chop wood. They don't have to pay tax on it. There's no stumpage fees. It's just kind of like go and, take 2 miles and you can collect your own hay and use it for your own purposes, that sort of thing. This is something that the English delegates really want to secure. They're worried that when settlers show up, they're going to plop down their houses right behind their houses, and they're going to lose access to this really important hay privilege. So this is really a land question. What's our relationship to the land? And Riel says this about it. As to this land question, I will say that for ourselves, and what he means by ourselves is the French delegates, the French Catholics, we cannot fix on any general rule at once, which will meet our requirements. And what he means there is, we think we should be asking for more than the 2-mile privilege. That's our position. He said, but if you, referring, and by you, he means the English delegates, but if you want this 2-mile grant, absolutely, I will leave it to you. I will leave it to yourselves. I only object in the way in which you propose to get it. Immediately after this, a Métis guy from an English parish, a guy named Thomas Bunn, he hops up and he says, we are very much obliged to you, Mr. Riel. Thanks, essentially. Thanks very much for saying that. But we are very strongly opposed to anything like a division between the French and the English people. And this also comes up. Whenever Riel is trying to think about, what do we get for the French community that's different from the English community and his own French delegates say, well, we're related to each other. It doesn't make sense for us to have different things. We don't want a different world, right? It makes no sense for an English land regime and a French land regime. Like, that makes no sense. We're in this together, right? So there is also this, the kinship is being animated in a particular political way in which people are saying we don't actually want two completely different scenarios, which I think is super interesting. So that kind of puts a little bit of cold water on this division thesis. This final one is one of my favorite. The other form of inward looking is also about the way Métis people fight in their own kind of even smaller worlds, not even just between French and English, but what about between English and between the French? This final little bit I want to walk you through is super interesting. Riel at the end of the convention wants to pass a motion that censures the Hudson's Bay Company, that says the Hudson's Bay Company has been a problem here for a really long time, and we're not happy about it. And essentially, they're a problem that we need to deal with. So he loses the vote to pass this, and it's recorded that several of his own French Catholic parishes, the representatives, voted against him. And so this is what happens next. Riel, and all of this is straight out of I'm not adding any of this, all of this is exactly what appeared in the paper. With great warmth, marching up and down the council chamber, the devil take it. We must win. The vote may go as it likes, but the measure which has now been defeated must be carried. It is a shame to have lost it, and it was even a greater shame because it was lost by those traitors, pointing to Charles Nolan, George Klein, and Thomas Harrison. Charles Nolan, not to be bullied by anyone, jumps up and said with indignation in French, I was not sent here, Mr. Riel, to vote at your dictation. I came here to vote according to my conscience. While there are some things for which we blame the company, the Hudson's Bay Company, there's a good deal for which we must thank them. I do not exculpate them, the company altogether, but I say that in time of need, we have often been indebted to them for assistance and kindness. What he's referring to here is the Hudson's Bay Company made credit and food supplies available to the community when the hunt was bad. And when winters were really long or when the crops weren't that great, the company did make sure that people didn't starve, in part Métis people are the primary customers and trade relations. That's where their trade relationship comes with. So it's very bad business for all your customers to starve, right? So it's better just to get them through so they keep patronizing your store, right? So it's not totally altruistic, but it's true. What he's saying is they did come through and make sure we didn't starve a number of times. Not to be outdone, Riel, back up on his feet. You must remember, he added angrily, that there is a provisional government, and though this measure has been lost by the voice of this convention, I have friends enough who are determined to add it to the list on their own responsibility. Let me just pause here. That's a threat. He's making a very clear threat that he doesn't care that he just lost this vote of the convention. He's going to figure out a way, probably by force, of censuring the company on his own, right? So Riel has some interesting kind of authoritarian tendencies that are not aligned with the rest of the community. So I'll just bracket that. Turning to the French section of the convention, he said, speaking rapidly and with great vehemence, and pointed threateningly at those he addressed, as for you, Charles Nolan, Tom Harrison, and George Klein, two of you, my own, relatives of my own, as for you, your influence as public men in this is finished in this country. Look at the position you have placed yourselves in. You have lost your influence. And then he added emphatically, forever. Charles Nolan, hop on his feet next. Let me tell you, Mr. Riel, that I was sent here by my parish. I never sought the position, and personally, if I am lost to public affairs, I would be rather glad of it. You, Mr. Riel, did what you could to prevent me coming here and failed. And if it suited my purpose to come back again, I would come at the call of my parish in spite of you. Anyone who's been to a Métis political gathering, this will be familiar. This will look very familiar. This is essentially the moment of kind of like this face, this finger, and don't tell me what to do, right? That's the moment that they're having, which has been reverberate. Like this is a key component of Métis politics today, right? Don't you dare tell me what to do. The thing that I think is super interesting about this is that what it shows is not just division writ large between French and English communities. There's a ton of things that are really, really important that people have different opinions on, even within, French language or English language communities, right? The English community was divided on a couple of things too, that people just were like, I don't know that I agree with that position. And so what I think we're seeing here is a community that's facing a really big set of decisions, and they're politically divided in that they don't agree, right? They just simply don't agree on a large number of things. Nolan, and this is the interesting kinship component of it. So yes, Nolan and Riel are related, but importantly, Tom Harrison, so one of the guys mentioned here, Tom Harrison, I believe, is married to Charles Nolan's sister. So they are also directly related. So Riel is, there's sort of like a complex web of relationship that's happening there. So again, even these relationships are playing out in really different and kind of controversial ways in which people just don't agree. But here's the thing that I think connects this to Indigenous political authority. Through the convention and the decisions that they were making on voting rights, land rights, what's happening is this Métis community has turned inward to say, what do we want, right? They're asserting themselves to say authoritatively who comes into their country, who comes into their territory, and importantly, on what terms. On what terms are these Canadians, these non-native people, going to be coming into our lands, right, and staying here potentially? So how are they going to do that, and what is the expectation for their behavior, right? That's what's really happening here. This is an internal look of Métis people asserting themselves and their own political authority in that territory. So that's vignette number one. I just love it. I just love a fight like this. Like, this is just so interesting to me. Vignette number two. This one I'll be a little bit quicker. Vignette number two. How do we get to the Rocky Mountains? How do we get to the Rocky Mountains? So this one again is about looking out. This is a shot of a little Métis encampment that's temporarily camped along the Bow River, just outside of what is now Calgary. And it's from the National Archives collection. I think it's 1820s, maybe a little bit later. Must be a little bit later. There's too many buildings in the background. Okay, let's take a look here. Vignette to the Rockies, event number 2, to the Rockies. In 1862, all of 3 of these vignettes happened very close to each other. So this is the earliest one in 1862. We just talked about one in 1869-70, and the final one I'll talk about is in the mid-1870s. So all of this is happening kind of around the same time. George Flett, who is also a Métis guy in the Convention of 40 the body I just talked about, in 1862, he writes a letter in the Nor'wester, and what he's doing is he's trying to encourage people to take up mining in the Rocky Mountains. He says, essentially, there's gold in them there hills, and he's trying to get people to be like, let's go get it. Let's go get that gold. I think we're perfect candidates to do it. This is one of the things that he writes in there. The most direct route to get to the gold mines would be through the Blackfeet country. Mr. James Sinclair, another very well-known family and well-known trader, crossed the mountains twice by this route, and from parties who accompanied him, I learned that the road is a good one. It is a good one. And then he also follows up with this statement, but the thought will suggest itself. How could we get through the Blackfeet? They are hostile and dangerous. My answer is, if we do not trouble the Indians, they will not trouble us. Our object should be to find the Indian camps on our route, and once there, we would be safe as within the walls of Fort Garry. So interesting, so interesting. So there's a couple of points that I want to make about this. The first one is, in this letter, the only people that he references are Métis people and the Blackfoot. He doesn't talk about any other Indigenous people. He doesn't talk about Cree, he doesn't talk about Saulteaux, he doesn't talk about Assiniboine, who are also peoples that regularly show up in Red River, right? That's like, they're there constantly, some of them permanently. So that's the first thing. He's really just concerned about Blackfoot folks. The second point is, this letter is super interesting in that it appears in Red River. Its primary audience is for Métis people, both in Red River, but also the surrounding region. Kind of what we think about as the homeland. Like everyone's kind of reading this newspaper, but primarily Métis people. And he's trying to encourage people to take this mining venture up. And he's essentially anticipating what Métis popular opinion is going to be about this notion. And he's anticipating people saying like, well, we can't do that because, and he's trying to get in front of that. That's essentially what this letter is designed to do. And the thing that he needs to point out is, everyone's going to need to know how we're actually going to get there. How do we get through Blackfoot country? The third point that I want to make is that the second half of this, our object should be to find the Indian camps. I'm not 100% sure what he's talking about there, but there's a couple of different interpretations that we could play with. So one interpretation is that he's referring to other Native people that they could stay with along the road. So a little bit earlier, I didn't quote this part, but a little bit earlier in the letter, he says, you know, one of the reasons why we're such good candidates for this mining gig is because we are, we speak multiple Native languages. We speak Cree, we speak Anishinaabe-Mowin. The paper publishes stories in Anishinaabe-Mowin, a written form, right? That's very normal. People speak multiple languages of other Indigenous peoples. That's not controversial. He said that's one of the reasons why we can do that. So one of the things I'm wondering if he's noting that the reason they should stay in Indian camps along the way is that they're finding like Cree camps and Saulteaux camps and Assiniboine camps, that those are the places that they'll be safe in because then they've got more numbers. That's one interpretation, that they don't have to worry about the Blackfoot because they'll be with a larger number of allied Indigenous peoples that they're also related to. That's one possibility. Another possibility that I was playing with is that what he might be saying is that if the Métis are clear to the Blackfoot, that we're just traveling, we're just coming through, right? We're just traveling, we're not staying, we're just passing through. That might allow the Métis to get through to the Rockies because they're not staying, right? The Blackfoot really, at this time, are concerned about Métis people being in their territory permanently. That's one of the things that keeps kind of popping up in inter-Indigenous politics in this time period. So he might also be saying, as long as we don't stay, the Blackfoot might not bother us. And they might just say like, okay, just keep on moving, right? Either way, I think it's really interesting, no matter how you kind of interpret this, he's writing this for a Métis audience that's kind of looking out at the plains and saying, yeah, we're from here, we're from the Qu'Appelle Valley, we're from, we're from around Edmonton, what is now Edmonton. We're not really from there. And we're gonna have to answer how it is that we move through that. And the thing that I think is important about this from a political authority standpoint is it's actually kind of really heartening, because Métis people are looking out at the plains and saying, in one part, I recognize Blackfoot political authority. I have to, as a Métis person, I have to be careful about how I move through that space, because there's a competing political authority there that's not Métis, right? That's not ours. So I think it's also about Métis people looking out and validating other Indigenous people's political authorities as well. So I think that's also why this vignette is kind of interesting, and it talks a little bit about belonging and territoriality. And then finally, vignette number 3, which I'm calling, "We would normally chase them out." So what I've got for you on the screen is a clip from the original one of the original treaties, or sorry, petitions rather, that the Blackfoot General Council sends to the government of the Northwest Territories. And in it, well, I'll talk a little bit about it in a second. We would normally chase them out. So during the 1870s, Métis people are under significant stress. The Manitoba Act has been brought in. There has now been a reign of terror that has kind of appeared in Métis territory. Métis people are being killed in the streets without justice being done. We know this. Métis people are fleeing for their lives from a number of very racist and violent Protestant Canadians. That is happening. And Métis people are also moving closer to the herds, and the herds are also moving closer to the mountains, to the Rockies as well. So there is this pressure that Métis people are moving in large numbers deeper onto the plains, into the west. That's also putting a lot of pressure on Blackfoot territory. They're seeing through the 1870s an increase in Métis traffic in and out of their territory. And so that is a problem that all components of the Blackfoot Confederacy are facing. And when that happens, a general council is usually called of the Blackfoot, in which they gather. So the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Bloods, or the Kainai, come together and they confront this challenge together, because it's happening to all of them. And what happened was, at the general council, they issue a petition that's drawn up and then sent to the government of the Northwest Territories and the Battlefords. And they state a number of interesting things in that petition. They state that we are perfectly willing that the mounted police and the missionaries should remain in the country, for we are much indebted to them for important services. This is important. They're saying particularly the Mounties are chasing out whiskey traders, and the Blackfoot are very appreciative of that. The whiskey trade was a horrible, horrible time in the Blackfoot Confederacy, and they are very much appreciating that the Mounties are chasing them out, chasing those American traders out. Very, very grateful. The other thing that they say is the Hudson's Bay Company may build a trading post in Blackfoot territory, should they wish, and they provide a suggested location of where they would like that fort. So they want that communicated on to the company. And then finally, the other thing that they say is that something needs to be done about the half-breeds and the Crees in large camps hunting buffalo, both summer and winter, in the very center of our lands. This is part of their response to the pressure that the Métis are feeling in moving further and further west, is that the Blackfoot are saying, the government of Canada, you need to do something about this, right? These people are becoming problems in our territory, and we need that to stop. And so that's partly what they're also saying. This shows up a lot in the 1870s and 80s. There's another piece that appears in the Fort Macleod Gazette in which they are named that these Red River half-breeds continue to engage in poor hunting practices in Blackfoot territory, and that's something, and they need to be chased out. This is a very common theme in Blackfoot country at this time, is like these Métis people are a problem, and they need to be dealt with. So I've got my notes sort of behind my screen here. I don't want to miss anything good. So the other kind of thing I want to add to this is the Fort Calgary component that Allison and I have been chatting about. one of the things, as this pressure to move further and further west is on the Métis Nation and the Crees as well, but in a different way, the Métis start establishing permanent settlements around Northwest Mounted Police forts. So around Fort Macleod, around Fort Calgary here, they start just showing up and just staying and just start building houses, and that they're not going anywhere. And this is noted by the Northwest Mounted Police as a problem that they are now in the middle of, that they would rather not be. So Colonel MacLeod, who's part of the command structure of the Northwest Mounted Police, he records in a letter that the Blackfoot leaders wrote to him again, and he's getting these letters a lot. They're complaining about this. And this is what MacLeod writes in his response to this. Now that we, the Northwest Mounted Police, have come into the Blackfoot's country, he finds that from all sides his old enemies, he's talking about Métis people and Crees, who he dare not attack, are under our protection, our Northwest Mounted Police protection, pressing in upon him. So he says one of the things that he's finding is like, we've been authorized to be here by the Blackfoot General Council, but the Blackfoot General Council is also telling us, keep the Métis out, right? There's this like tension here that's developed, that they're stuck in the middle, but they're also required to protect the Métis because they're also crown subjects, right? They can't actually distinguish about that. And what he's identifying here is this long tradition through the 1870s, the 1860s and 70s, that Blackfoot would normally deal with this on their own. And they would, what we kind of see from this is they would chase the Métis out, which is why George Flett is thinking about, how do we get through there? Blackfoot are hostile and dangerous to us. The reason he's saying that is because there is this long tradition of Métis people trying to go into Blackfoot country to access the herds, the buffalo herds, and being driven out by Blackfoot response parties. Well, essentially like quick response teams, if we want to think about them in those terms. And so that's kind of changed everything. So if we put it all together, what do we see? So those are the three vignettes, little scenes that I've kind of painted for you. I think they're all so interesting with their own interesting kind of idiosyncrasies and details. But if we put them all together, these vignettes, I think, are all part of seeing Indigenous political authority in national homelands. For Métis people, we talk a lot about being part of our own homeland, but our homeland is also potentially abutted or aligned with other Indigenous people's homelands too. And all of us are asserting our political authority in different ways in our own territory. So all of these are about political authority. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So the first one in that sense, where Riel is fighting with English delegates and then fighting with his own family and the French delegates. The first vignette, Métis are saying who can come to their territory and under what terms. Who comes and what are the terms? Now the terms are super controversial, but they are still looking at each other being like, we should come up with terms, right? We should say what we want here because this is our territory. If I jump to the last one, the third vignette, the Blackfoot are doing exactly the same thing. What they're doing is they're saying who comes here and under what terms do they come here? And that's what they're essentially responding to, right? And then if we look at the second vignette, one of the things I think it's interesting, this one's so interesting. It's Métis people looking out at the greatness of the Northwest and saying, how do we get from point A to point B? And how do we respect other Indigenous people's political authority, right? How do we navigate political authority ourselves? And sometimes we do that badly, right? Sometimes we do that badly. And sometimes we do that well, right? This is the point that I think Carrie captured just so well. Sometimes we send out our own Métis diplomats and they smooth it out for us, right? They lay the framework and that allows us to be there for a period of time, right? And then potentially we stay for a bit and then we leave or something happens, but all of that is smoothed out with Métis diplomats, right? Other times, we know this, Métis people just go. We just pack up and we go. And then we have to deal with the fact that we might be attacked and they might try to chase, other Indigenous peoples might try to chase us out, right? So both of those things are happening. And sometimes they come to peaceful resolutions and sometimes they don't. But all of that is about looking out and seeing other Indigenous people's political authority and having to grapple and respect that on a certain level, having to respect that. So those are the three vignettes. I hope you think that they're interesting at least. I think together they show us shades of Indigenous territories of belonging. I want to be clear about this. Two things I want to be clear about. The first is, this isn't like borders the way we think about them today. It's not like Métis people standing at a border and being like, passport, please. It's not like Blackfoot people being like, passport, please. That's not happening. What we have instead is shades. Think about like when you take a pencil on its edge and you kind of shade something, right? It creates fuzzy lines, fuzzy spaces. There are absolutely those fuzzy spaces, but this helps us see about where Métis people and other Indigenous peoples see their own senses of belonging, And then the second thing I would kind of say about all this is, none of this, I don't want to argue that Métis people don't have relationships here in Blackfoot territory. We absolutely do. Some of those are conflictual, but some of them are also about long-standing multi-generation relationships in which you enter into adoptions with each other. And that was also part of the diplomatic tradition of the 19th century. You would end a conflict frequently by Métis people being adopted into the Blackfoot Nation, and the Blackfoot Nation having folks adopted into the Métis Nation. That was a normal component of Métis diplomacy before Canada got in the way, to be completely frank about it. So I think that, but that it doesn't make it, that doesn't abrogate or doesn't undo Indigenous political authority. There still are these political authorities that we have to respect, that are about Blackfoot looking at Métis political authority and Métis people looking at Blackfoot political authority. Again, through these spaces of shading. So I hope you enjoyed that, Miigwech. And I think Allison and I are gonna chat a little bit more about it, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can speak for everyone and say thank you so much. So fascinating, and I love hearing about your research for many reasons. Some are that it's just so nuanced in a way. It complicates so much history that we don't get that picture often. And I think it also, one of the great things about it is it really decenters what we're looking at in terms of, typically it's settler, colonial, white folks at the center of all of these stories, and they're not here, so it's just such a different, more complex picture than we usually get. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I have the privilege of asking some questions, but if you have a question, anyone out there, please drop it into the Q&A. I'll be paying attention, I promise. Yeah, please feel free to ask Daniel a question. But I'd like to start by asking, as you're reflecting back on these different research projects that you've done, maybe specifically the one for the CIH, what surprised you the most about the stories that your research revealed?
I think, oh, man, so I'm a trained political scientist. That's actually what my training is, but man, I read a lot of history. And I love it. I love it. I always worry, oh, it's just great. I worried when I was doing my PhD, I was like, I wonder if anyone's gonna say like, Daniel, we're gonna kick you out of the political science club and you're gonna have to go into the history club.
It's better there anyway.
That's what I hear. I hear the water's great, so jump on in.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I was like most surprised about with the CIH, with the divisions between the French and the English, is we've focused so much on French and Catholic and English and Protestant divisions that I think we've kind of overemphasized them, for a really long time. Like from the history books that were being written in the 50s about Métis people, like there was a sense in those books that, I'm thinking about, there's this book by Morton, in which he kind of tackles this a little bit in the opening kind of chapters of his book. And I just think that he saw French and essentially Catholic and Protestant differences because that's what he was interested in. And so he was kind of aware that there's this relatedness between communities, but all he could see was French and Catholic and French and Catholic and French and Catholic. And I was just so surprised that when you kind of look very closely at what these leaders, these are community leaders, they are elected by their community to go and represent their interests, and they show up there and they're like, I'm not gonna stick it to the French Quarter because, for heaven's sakes, I got cousins over there. Like that's not good for me, And I think that we and this is what, I don't know if Brenda McDougall's on the call, but her work has been very influential to me about getting me to stop seeing French and Catholic and English and Protestant, and seeing instead kinship and relationships and families, and to see the way those are actually seem to me to be more explanatory for the things for the divisions and the disagreements that we had at that time, in a really important time. And that in part, it was also the thing that I would say that surprised me doing this work, is how many of these things are still kind of the things that we're living with today. The decisions about separating Métis people from Indian people was something that was right at the heart of that convention. I haven't talked about it here, but it's one of the things that I'm also studying. We're still living with the consequences of that, right? Of these divisions that we had to build ourselves in order to survive, and they didn't end up protecting us. Like, all of this stuff just ended up being just so long lived. Like, all of these debates still matter. They still matter. Anyway.
Yeah, and we can talk about the relevance today more if you like, because I think a lot of people would find that fascinating. Just one more question kind of about your research. Where is your research headed? What are you hoping to find out more, to know more about as you continue with this research?
There's a couple of pieces that I'm trying to head into. The general goal of this is, I think, as Indigenous people, we can do a better job of politically organizing with each other. We spend a lot of money, and we spend a lot of time fighting each other. For what? We face exactly the same problem writ large. Like, there are absolutely smaller components of the problem that we face that are unique or particular, but on the whole, we're struggling with exactly the same thing. Our lands have been taken from us unjustly, and now we are impoverished in our own territories. That has been the thing from day one that we all are facing. And I think if we think about this more from about a kinship perspective, we can organize in a far more strategic and helpful way if we see, first of all, the origins of these fights, but also the way that we're not helping ourselves by picking on each other, right? We're not doing either communities, our communities or the other communities around us that we're related to. We're not doing anybody any favors by doing that. And so partly I'm trying to pull these things apart to say, if we have a little bit more respect for each other's political authority, that's become the basis from which that we start then organizing together, right? As opposed to, and in some cases, we sued each other for what? Like, what did we get from that, right? So that's part of it. And then the other thing that I want to head in the direction of now, I just was recently tenured, which is a wonderful thing. Thank you. One of the things I'm interested in doing now is shifting this to more community-based work. So I love archives. I love reading the transcripts of our ancestors and the fights that they were having. I love that work. One of the things that Carrie really opened my eyes to, and a number of people in the last year or so, is there's a whole bunch of really important community stories that provide both color but also challenge some of the records that these debates and that sort of thing that I've been reading about. And I need, one of the things I'm really excited about doing is weaving more of that in. Like, there are wonderful stories of relationships between the Blackfoot Confederacy and Métis families. Shauna Cunningham has shared a number with me about her family and the way that they were long-standing and respected traders in Blackfoot country. And also the stories of Métis diplomats who built very long-standing relationships with the Blackfoot Confederacy. That's the stuff, those oral stories, I'm missing those. And those are just as important as these debates and these petitions. Those are equally important. So that's kind of the next trajectory of this work.
Nice. And especially because you're talking about, families being at the heart of so much of the research, even in the archive, getting then those actual oral histories would be amazing.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, we don't write it, like most families don't write things down. One of the gifts to the Métis Nation has been the Hudson's Bay Company Archives and the Provincial Archives of Manitoba, in part because those entities thought it was important to write a bunch of stuff down, but Métis families frequently didn't. And so they pass things down orally. There are wonderfully rich stories that shape and color this in ways that I haven't quite fully understood. I can't fully understand yet unless I engage with them. So yeah, no, you're exactly right.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn, we have some good questions in the Q&A. Just as a side, Annette said we would welcome you into the History Club, Daniel. I can second that motion if we're doing official historian business. Diane asked, can you please elaborate on the term Métis mediators?
Oh, yeah. Great. So one of the things that happens a lot for the Métis Nation, let me just back this up. All Indigenous peoples have their own diplomats and mediators. They all do. Métis people got kind of picked as mediators in part because, again, there was a very robust record in the Hudson's Bay Company archives that detailed our role as mediators, but all Indigenous peoples had their own diplomats and mediators. So what I mean by that is there's a number of families that spend a lot of time out on the plains. They're guiding buffalo hunts. They're captains of Métis buffalo hunting communities, those sorts of things. And one of the things that they end up doing is they develop relationships with other Indigenous peoples as they're moving around the plains. So let me give you two examples. So the first example is the Sioux. I haven't talked a lot about them, but they're the Sioux, the Great Sioux Nation, which is made up of Dakotas and Lakotas and so on. That very powerful political node is frequently in opposition to the Métis political node. There's lots of peace treaties, lots of battles, lots of animosity. Métis people frequently have to dispatch a mediator to go and essentially like smooth things out with the Sioux. And so that happens in a number of moments in which Métis people outfit a diplomat, a mediator, with tobacco, gifts, and political authority, saying, you know, here's the deal that you can go out and make. And this happens in the 1840s in one of the stories that I'm more familiar with, in which the Métis go and have to like essentially smooth over a very violent situation with the Sioux, in which a number of people on both sides died. And again, what happened is the mediator negotiated a peace with the Great Sioux Nation. I believe it was with the Lakotas, and they adopted each other's individuals. The people that had lost family members then had their family members replaced in adoption by the other side as an act of trying to bring peace. And you can understand why. You don't go to war if you got to fight your cousin, right? That's not something you tend to do, or your brother for the most part. And then also build agreements for hunting. So you know what? We're going to hunt together next year. We're going to share the resources. We're going to meet at this particular point on this particular day, and we're going to go out and get the herds, and we'll split everything. Everything will be 50-50. And so that's the kind of stuff that Métis mediators ended up doing. And so that's one example that kind of gets the point that I want to make. There's so many examples of this. The other one is like people being dispatched to Blackfoot country. These Bisters are very well known in Blackfoot country, as are a number of the other diplomatic families. And they go out there and they just, again, try to smooth things over, right? And usually these agreements that the mediators make are temporary. So they last for a year or two, and then they have to be renewed or they're ended. And that's a much easier way to think about treaties than one and done, right? That doesn't happen in the plains. It's about, this works now, we'll see in a couple of years if this is going to work. And if not, we got to change it, right? And that's a much more realist understanding of the nature of politics and treaty making. So that, I hope that gets it. Those are those really important mediators that go out and just, let's take the temperature down. Everybody's got to just cool down here, right? Because nobody wants to die. Right? That's essentially what they're out there to do. Nobody has to die.
Right. Great. I'm turning to the Q&A. Yvonne is also saying, thank you for this fascinating talk. Would you say history is repeating itself in terms of how the Métis and the Blackfoot interact today? It's a tricky question.
Man, that's good. Oh, is that Yvonne Poitras-Pratt? Is that who that is?
Yeah.
Hi, Yvonne. What a good question. And from such a thoughtful, such a thoughtful scholar. What a wonderful scholar, Yvonne, doing incredibly important work in Indigenous education and also like education with her own community in the settlements from Fishing Lake. Just brilliant work. That's a good point. I'm worried about that. It might not be, but it's possible. This is kind of the takeaway point that I always want for this particular body of research. If we try to be respectful of Blackfoot political authority, I think that still means that Métis people belong here, right? Métis people belong here. We have, as Carrie pointed out, we have long-standing relationships with this territory now. We can have those long-standing relationships with territory while also respecting Blackfoot political authority, and also the authority of the other signatories to Treaty 7, the Stoney and the Tsuut'ina, right? We have to respect those political authorities. So some of that means that we might have to roll back some of our own nationalist territorial claims about what our homeland is. In part because that means that they're going to recognize our claims, right? Because we're not overreaching, and we're going to recognize their claims because they're not overreaching, right? And then it becomes more about relationships. So here's one of the examples, Yvonne, that I was thinking about. This is stuff that's work that I'm working on that it's not quite ready for prime time, but let me just kind of pitch it to you. What happens if we think about this as a Métis embassy in Calgary? Like, what does it look like? What does the political world for Métis look like if we open a Métis embassy in Blackfoot territory and say, this is our embassy, you know, it's an embassy that serves Métis people in this space, but it also is there to support Blackfoot claims and Blackfoot initiatives. That changes things, right? That means us showing up when the Blackfoot need us. It means showing up at their court cases, showing up at their rallies, and also for them to then recognize our presence in their space in a way that's conducive to other Indigenous people's political authority. So that's one of the ways that I've been thinking about this. And it also then starts to formalize some of those longstanding familial relationships that Métis people do have in Blackfoot territory. I don't know, I hope. So I don't think, we might not be repeating it, but I kind of do worry about that. But I think there's ways that we can get around it, and we both win. We both win in that case, right? That's what, win-win. That's what I'm always trying to find.
Yeah, I'm going to jump around a bit because I think Joshua has a question that potentially kind of builds off of what you're talking about. They said you do a great job of bringing out awareness of and respect for authority of peoples in their spaces. Here's a question. Are there different reasons why that authority appears as authority to the different peoples? Or is there a shared conception of what constitutes authority?
Ooh, that's good. Oh, that's
a good one, yeah.
That's good. I think in the 18th century, I'll frame it this way. I think in the 18th century, one of the things I think that is true, is happening there is an element of mutually recognized political authority. And this is the reason I think that. These peoples have been living with each other for a very long time, right? We think about it in the 18th century as if that's, you know, I get trapped in this. Sometimes I think that the world started in the 19th century, you know, started in the 1800s. I sometimes get trapped in that, and that's wrong. There were oral histories and oral stories that explained people's relationship to each other that dated well before the 1800s. One of the things that I think is happening there is a common language that's happening across the plains, both literally, and that language tends to be Cree. Like, even if you're a Blackfoot person, you want to be able to trade. Usually the language of trade is Cree. It's just kind of what happened. You might not speak it well, but you'll speak it enough to conduct transactions. But also figuratively, in the sense that there's an expectation that people have come to understand how to move about these spaces, and also what's required when you are offside. Some of that, and I think your question is really great, because some of that is about the fuzziness, right? Sometimes they don't necessarily agree on what the boundaries are, but you do ultimately have to live with these other Indigenous peoples. And it's not like a COVID world. People are moving around all the time, and people are out on the plains, and you've got to be able to navigate these spaces. And so what emerges from a political diplomacy perspective is an element of common language about how we do this. And here, my colleague Adam Gaudry has kind of really, I think, lifted the lid on this in a really interesting way. And I'll give you a little snippet of what he's trying to work on. He says one of the things that becomes part of this common language is the distinction between family and strangers. That across the plains, there is an understanding that you're family or you're a stranger. I think the Cree word for Blackfoot actually translates loosely into stranger. I have to check that. My colleague Jesse Lawyer has written on this. But one of the things that's happening there is, through these acts of diplomacy, both sides see each other as strangers, and these acts of diplomacy are designed to turn them into family. right? That's partly why adoption is so important through like early 1800s, late 1700s. All the adoptions that are happening is because you're converting people from strangers into family. And there's a common diplomatic and a political authority language that's designed to do that. And because you know where you're from and where you're not, you got to engage in that. You want to go hunting in Sioux country? You better have a deal on this. And I'll add this one thing. This is super. Okay, I'll add this one thing and then I'll stop. I went and looked through the Dunmore papers, and there's this guy named the Earl of Dunmore. And in the 1860s, he strikes out on the plain on essentially what is a safari, and he's being led by a number of Métis guides and Métis supply people, workers. And the guy who's leading is a guy named James McKay. And Big Jim McKay is another one of those big diplomatic persons, both big in terms of his presence, but also big in terms of like, he's a big guy. He weighs like 200, he's like 200 pounds. Like he's a big guy. And he's also quite short. So people talk about him being kind of like a sphere almost. Anyway, but very loud on his feet. Apparently he was a very good dancer. So anyway, back to the ranch. One of the things that happens is he comes across a party of Sioux, and he has to give this big speech. And the thing that he says is, you may not recognize the people that I am with, but you will recognize me. My footsteps run here and there through your territory. These people are with me and they are under my protection. And we need to engage in a treaty that allows us to pass, but I'm the one who's mediating that. So he uses his own position as having been turned from stranger into family to allow the access to the territory of Europeans. And the Sioux are originally quite upset about this, but then there's a series of speeches and negotiations, and they come around to it, and then they permit it. So there is this kind of common language that I think people are recognizing each other's political authority in important ways, because they patch up the disagreements for the same reason, right? We screwed this up. We better patch things up. Yeah.
Super interesting. Moving to, so Alice has a question more about the Northwest Mounted Police and Fort Calgary, mentioning that they were struck by shops and businesses around the fort that were owned by Métis families, maybe a little bit later than the vignettes that you pointed out. But she's asking about, kind of her initial maybe reaction was that the Métis were this buffer between settlers and the Blackfoot, but maybe it's more complicated than that. And also asking if Blackfoot folks were running businesses, maybe competing in that way around the fort as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a partial, this is good. What an excellent question. I have a partial answer for you. We do know, one of the things that is happening is that the Métis seem to be using the Northwest Mounted Police more as a shield than anything else, right? They're getting to go places, quite frankly, that I think that they knew that they wouldn't be able to go to normally. I think they were wise to this, right? They know that the Northwest Mounted Police aren't going to allow a raid party from the Blackfoot Confederacy to chase them out. Like, I think that they know that. So that's part of it. The second part is, you're right about these different forms of economic relationships that are also starting to pop up. We do know in the opening pages of the Calgary Herald, so the Calgary Herald starts publishing, what, 1882? I think they start publishing there. In their opening pages, they have a series of stories about the relationship between Calgary and the Blackfoot people at Siksika. There's stories about Blackfoot people coming into town, being around the forts for a variety of reasons. And it's kind of covered quite regularly in those pages. I did not see a lot about Blackfoot businesses, in part because what starts to happen, and this is really sad, what starts to happen is those Blackfoot folks who normally engage in trade with settlers and with the Northwest Mounted Police staff, they start having a much harder time because of the racism that starts being imbued into Calgary. So there's a number of stories about like chasing Blackfoot people out of Calgary because they're in to pick up supplies, and the shop owners won't allow it, and so they start calling the Northwest Mounted Police to chase them. So it becomes a bit of a problem. So I haven't heard specifically about the relationship of Blackfoot people owning businesses and being part of a business kind of relationship with the NWP and the Métis folks. But I certainly have seen stories about white businesses refusing to do business with Blackfoot people, and also calling the police to chase them away. So, and that really picks up speed in the 1880s as an increasing number of white settlers start to come into this space. And again, a legacy that we're still dealing with. Like we're still dealing with that today.
Great. I'm not sure what time we're going to. 8 o'clock-ish?
Want to go to 8? We want to do one more?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a question from Shauna Cunningham, I think you mentioned.
Oh, hi, Shauna.
So she writes, I find it interesting to focus on Métis peoples moving from Red River west into Blackfoot country. However, there were Métis people in what was the Northwest Territories, particularly the Big Lake settlement in what is now St. Albert. This river lot-based community existed as early as the 1870s, if not before. Some of these individuals, like John Cunningham, were trading with the Blackfoot, participating in buffalo hunting, and basically had trade alliances with the Blackfoot, allowing them to go in and out of Blackfoot communities. Have you looked into the records of Métis people who lived in Alberta prior to 1885?
This is yes, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. This is exactly the trajectory that this work is going in. Part of it was, I kind of stumbled upon this by accident. Like I was kind of looking at a different question and I was like, oh, there's actually this interesting kind of Winnipeg, kind of like Red River Blackfoot territory thing that's happening. But you're right. One of the things that has been clear about in the kind of, now that this first part of this work is done, is it's clear that there were a series of relationships and potentially like kinship treaties that allowed Métis people to kind of come and go, right? That there were folks that they knew, that the Blackfoot knew were Métis, that had authority to be in certain places at certain times for particular purposes that, again, the Blackfoot wanted, right? So you weren't going to drive people out that were helpful to you in the same way that, you know, the RCMP, the missionaries, and the Hudson's Bay Company are kind of invited. That is also happening with other Métis families. What also seems to happen, so this connects really well to the earlier point about, is this kind of like one single political authority that everyone kind of like can recognize? And the answer, I think, connects really well to this is no, in part because people are distinguishing between different Métis communities and people that they want in their community and people that they don't. So the piece of this seems to me to be about primarily the Red River folks being problematic, people that the Blackfoot seem to be chasing out, but also the people who are attached to the Crees. Anyone who's kind of like showing up in kind of like a kinship alliance in Blackfoot territory, they're a problem. But if like there's lots of Métis traders that seem to have been able to negotiate at least temporary, if not long-term relationships with the Blackfoot that allowed them to come and go in really interesting ways. So again, it's about, I think probably what makes those treaties able to be negotiated is respect for Blackfoot tradition, right? People show up and say, okay, we're gonna listen to the fiddle that's played here as opposed to the fiddle that's played back home, right? Which is the framework that I've been using to try and like understand Blackfoot territoriality, is like, well, if the fiddler's boss in a Métis tradition, well, I'm in Blackfoot territory, I better listen to that fiddler and then adjust, right? And adjust my steps. Maybe I dance differently, I dance faster, quicker, slower, whatever. But I'm now listening to those tunes, right? Because I'm in their territory. And so I think you're right, Shauna. I think that this is also about these very particular types of relationships that people are building over long periods of time to allow access and trade and kinship and that sort of thing. So yes, yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
Great. Well, I guess we have a few more questions, but Noreen has popped in, so I wonder if we're going to end it there. But it's mostly great questions and compliments to Daniel.
Email me. Send me an email if you want to keep chatting about
especially the compliments. Send those his way.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just one more reason to curse the pandemic, because I know if we had the wine and snacks, we'd be standing around for a long time. Now, Daniel, talking about everything you've just laid out for us, really, First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who came this evening and joined us and engaged enthusiastically in the Q&A. And I'm sure all of you will thank me, or join me, sorry, in thanking Daniel for his exuberant and illuminating talk. You may have hidden the methodology, Daniel, but the great learning behind the ease and clarity of your exposition was very clear. Thank you, Alison, for your stellar moderating and joining us. I'm sorry it couldn't have been at Fort Calgary as originally intended. And Carrie, thank you so much for your beautiful blessing and starting us off in such a wonderful way. And as always, Sean, Lindsay, thank you so much for keeping everything running behind the scenes. Please, all of you, visit the CIH website at arts.ucalgary.ca/CIH and subscribe to our mailing list if you have not done so already, to find out more about upcoming CIH hosted events and how you can further support the Institute. And enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone, and keep very safe and well. Thank you so much.